I think my biggest takeaway with this week's episode of My Hero Academia was how much I enjoyed seeing how much further Shigaraki has grown as a leader, even since the last time we really focused in on him, really to see the difference between his introduction to now. I think there's a clear reason why he's helming the League of Villains right now, and I think just the idea of understanding that you're not even just going to submit yourself underneath the Yakuza leader. You recognize that, like, hey, I'm gonna stab him in the back. He's gonna recognize that I'm going to stab him in the back. So I'll lend two of my top people to him, and then in the middle of basically the heroes coming marching in on their biggest mission, I'll make sure that there's a little sabotage to help him out. It's like, I love how the characters in this series just aren't idiots. They're not just like meatheads with a lot of power. There actually is planning, and just the idea of all the little chess maneuvers that these characters are doing, and how you have someone as powerful as Overhaul literally fleeing, right? You would think, okay, based on what everyone's saying, he can just touch someone and they're dead, unless he wants them to come back. Yet, there's a plan in motion, something that he has to wait for the right moment to unleash, and based on the drug and what we've seen so far, it's clear he's waiting for that shit to be mass-produced before he launches his attack. And the idea of, like, the League of Villains working alongside them while they wait for their time, like, everyone's actually, they have a logical plan, and you don't say that too often, especially because so many series, they focus on, like, two points of views, the bad guys, the good guys. But here, we got, like, essentially two groups of antagonists, and then we got a big group of protagonists, but there's also their own little divisions and story arcs going on, and it feels like all of them are interesting in following and focusing in on, and you don't say that too often. And I have to say, I'm really impressed with both Shigaraki and Overhaul in this episode, and something I wasn't expecting to say, especially once I started seeing what they were doing with the directing. It's something I typically hate because I feel like a lot of times authors, anime directors, they make it feel very jarring. But this week's episode, they handled it beautifully, and I love this episode overall, even though they kept flashing back and forth between past and present. Generally, the reason I'm not a huge fan of that direction choice is, like, if you do it like once or twice, it's usually pretty okay. It doesn't interrupt the flow of an episode. But here, we focus back and forth, and not just with like one character, it was on all the sides. We were focusing back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, seeing the past, like the then and the now, the then and the now. And usually that would disrupt the flow of the episode. Like, you're focusing on like a big battle, and then they go to a flashback, and then they go back here, and then they focus on something not even relating to that battle, but it's another character's backstory. But with this episode, and just this mission overall, there's essentially three sides at play. We got the Yakuza, we got the League of Villains, and then of course we got Deku's hero side and them charging in. So it actually made a lot of sense to focus back and forth on a multitude of perspectives to get the idea of either what they're fighting for, why they're a part of this, why someone like, say, Shigaraki would kind of bend over to someone. Like, he's not the character you would expect to follow someone, he wants to lead, and like, it just felt, instead of it feeling jarring and like it was a mess, it felt like there was proper execution, and that we needed the then, we needed the now, and it actually added onto it, which not many anime episodes can say, especially ones that try to like go back and forth. They're trying to be artsy, they're trying to make it look a lot more interesting than it actually is. But no, this week's episode, despite using directing choices that typically they rub me the wrong way, I feel like they're taking away from the important subject matter, just excusing like, hey, nothing's really interesting happening in the present, so I'll give you some backstory because that seems a little more interesting. No, here, it all added onto it, and added onto the amazing layer that is the enjoyment factor to this anime. And something that I've definitely complimented but really want to hammer down this episode is how interesting it is that it's not even just the protagonist side that have like this empathy and caring for one another. Like, the antagonists, especially with the League of Villains, it's interesting to see how much they do care for one another, and especially seen by just Shigaraki and how he is so much different than someone like Overhaul. Overhaul's this type of character who rules with an iron fist. Most of these people are just following him out of fear, and then you have some characters who are following because, holy shit, this man's strong. I don't like him as a person, but this man can put up a fight, so I'm going to keep trying to beat him. There's definitely not a lot of loyalty going on here, but then when you look at the League of Villains, even though they are villains, it's interesting how the author went the direction of humanizing them without excusing their actions. A lot of authors and just stories in general, they're afraid to make the bad people look like a human, look like a person that cares for what they're doing, because, I don't know, I guess the masses, they aren't ready to accept that, hey, you can write a good character that isn't relatable. You can have a serial killer, but write him in a way that you're like, oh, I understand why this character is like this, why they think doing what they're doing is okay, but it's not saying, hey kids, go do this, right? What I love is how when we're really focusing in on this, especially when you look at Twice, this character is in incredible amount of pain. They've literally just lost one of their comrades, and rather than just like doing an overhaul of like, oh, it's just expendable assurance, no, there's actually regret and remorse there. Seeing what Toga and Twice were doing in this episode and how they're actually willing to challenge Shigaraki when saying, hey, I'm gonna ship you off to the people we don't like, and then seeing how he was actually rising to the occasion of not only relating to what they're saying, understanding their points of view, but showcasing why he is fit to be leader. The fact that we have two separate antagonist groups going up against our main characters and how there's even internal conflict between them, it feels like they're not just adding on antagonists just so there's more people to fight, but rather they're adding on different stories. There's actually personal connections, and in a lot of ways, excusing some of the things that they say, it feels like they're almost being written the same way a lot of authors write their protagonists, as if you understand these connections, you understand their interpersonal relationships. We're not here to say, oh, I connect with killers, or I connect with bad serial killers, or, you know, just monsters, but you're like, oh, this really feels like a group of people who have a strong connection, and the death that we saw at the beginning of the season, it wasn't disposable for them. And even if someone like Shigaraki didn't have too much of a connection to the person that was killed, he understands how much of a value that was to these people, and he has to make sure that they feel comfortable with his leadership. And based on that death, it kind of hit them all, which I really love. I wasn't expecting, especially when you see just how dominating his presence is, that overhauls that is. He easily could have stole the show this season, but the fact that they're actually not only giving characters like Red Riot their chance to shine, but Shigaraki kind of rising to the occasion in his own way and just appearing so intelligent, like his plan makes logical sense, but all the plans kind of make sense, is a really interesting feeling, and I have to give mad props to just this story in general, as once again they took something that easily could have just been disposable, just a lot of action, a lot of pretty looking things, and, you know, generic personalities. The characters across the board actually feel human, even on the antagonist side, and that's something I crave, especially in like a superhero story. It's usually at best you get the human backstory for your main character and then you call it a day. But here they all make logical sense and feel like a person even if they are twisted in their own right. The most like normal flow to this episode would be in the first third where we get a lot of Red Riot stuff, just kind of closing up that little battle. And when I saw that man starting to get back up, I was like, please do not do what I was complimenting and saying, hey, you guys avoided escalation. You weren't just powering up randomly. And I was so happy to see that the battle just it stopped there. Even though he got back up, I love how he's just saying it's a draw and it's not a draw whatsoever. What are you saying? But I love how you have a character who I thought, even with last week, was going to be more of a meathead, someone with a lot of strength, didn't really think, but to actually see he's following someone so scummy, not out of loyalty, but just respect, damn, you got a lot of power, I'm going to try to kill you. And the fact that he fights in a way that he wants to fight to the death, and the only reason he didn't try to fight them again was that, yeah, he was actually pretty wounded, and he wants to go at it at an even playing field. I actually really respect what he was saying in this episode, and I wasn't expecting to come out of this episode saying that. I didn't even expect to have more content with him, and the whole Red Riot situation, I thought that was just completely wrapped up, but it was so interesting to see just the dialogue, especially between him and Fat Gum, and how it almost feels like a character who could easily switch sides should you show him someone with even more power than someone like Overhaul. And something that I think may go overshadowed, but I think is really important to highlight, is the fact that Red Riot gained the respect out of a villain. And the reason it's so interesting and so important is that if you really look at the grand picture of our protagonist side, characters like Deku, they don't feel like they belong in this situation. This is pro-heroes going up against pro-villains, people that are going to die in this mission. And the fact that we're getting moments where these heroes, that even though they're not strong enough by themselves to take out a villain like this, it still feels like they're impressing not only the people they're surrounded by, the people that they came charging into this building with, but also the people they're fighting. And it's not because of this generic, oh, you're my rival now because, you know, you have a cool looking ability, but rather seeing the determination, it kind of reminds the villain of himself, of putting yourself in danger, and saying, you know what, if I get killed by this punch, so be it, but I gotta stand my ground. The relatability between these characters is so amazing, and the fact that they're not relying solely on saying, hey, to just relate to the viewer all the time, but rather, let these characters stand tall as themselves without saying you have to feel a connection to this character. You have to feel like you relate to them, or you've seen someone in your own life like this. but rather let all these characters stand tall as people, so when moments like these happen, it feels like even if you do have some sort of personal connection of like, oh, that reminds me of something in my life, or struggles, or things like that, whether that happens or not, everything feels important. It feels like when villains do scummy things, even if you personally disagree with it, you understand their mindset, which is saying a hell of a lot. With as many characters as this anime has, especially this fight, the number of personalities should make it feel janky and like it's a mess, like no one's getting enough time to shine. Once again, going back to that then and now kind of back and forth, it allowed us to get a variety of just points of view and really make sure that no one is feeling disposable or forgettable. Like, we could just have moments with Night Eye just doing incredible, just insane maneuvers. You're thinking, why is this businessman a part of this crew? And then you're saying, oh shit, this man's got some serious punch to him. You could just focus on things like that, and the fandom would probably just eat it all up. Like, oh, look, a fan favorite character like Night Eye, he's doing something cool. Or look at Red Riot, he did something cool. But rather, it's all built on the personal relationships, and that is so amazing. An episode like this, in pretty much any other anime's hands, I would find probably enjoyable, but not really, like, worth hyping up, right? It's like, okay, yeah, we're getting to the main punchline, yeah, the preview for next week, that looks way better than this episode. And while I do think the PV for next week looks better than this episode, I still look at this episode incredibly fondly, as if the idea of focusing on any one of these characters, and I mean it, any one of them, I'm like, okay, let's see what you have to offer. I haven't seen you at all, or I haven't seen much of you. Let's see what you have to offer, or we're focusing in on a character I recognize or really do love. It feels like they all matter, and the fact that I can look forward to seeing the villains, the antagonists, as much as any of our focal and main characters, my favorite characters, it's saying a hell of a lot about the writing quality in this season in particular. Really, ever since the hero killer content was introduced, the series has just exploded into such a masterfully crafted series, and I am just once again blown away by the sheer quality and determination into this team that is putting their passion and hard work towards such a quality source material. I am once again blown away, but I'd be interested in hearing, what did everyone think, either for source material readers, anime originals? I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people hyping up next week. I've heard next week is a lot of people's favorite fighter, one of their favorite fights that's going to be adapted in this season. But in terms of this episode, what the hell is everyone feeling? Do let me know. Be sure to like the video if you did enjoy, and remember to hit that subscribe button if you have been new. So until next time, everyone, please take care and have a good one.